The ship was small and ugly, and every alien who saw it thought the same thing. What a joke. Captain Adiz Okonkwo stood at the bridge of the UES Olive Branch and stared through the viewport at the largest structure she had ever seen in her life. A ring of gold and silver metal spinning slowly around a dying white star at the center of the galaxy, stretching so wide that entire planets could have fit inside its curves like marbles in a bowl. This was the Oriat Spire, the seat of the Galactic Concord, home to the governing body of over 4,000 spacefaring civilizations. And today, for the first time in the history of the human race, a ship from Earth had come knocking on its door. "We are being scanned," said Lieutenant Marrow from the sensor console, his voice tight with nerves. "Let them scan," Okonkwo said calmly, and she straightened her uniform and clasped her hands behind her back. The Olive Branch had taken 11 months to reach the galactic core, using the FTL drive that humanity had only recently built, a drive that most species in the Concord had mastered thousands of years ago. And the ship itself was nothing compared to the massive cruisers and elegant trade vessels that drifted past them like whales ignoring a minnow. A docking signal came through and guided them to a port on the lower ring of the spire, the section reserved for cargo shuttles and sanitation vehicles. And when Okonkwo and her crew of 40 stepped off the ship, they were greeted not by diplomats, but by a bored-looking insectoid clerk who barely glanced at them before tapping a screen. "Species designation," the clerk buzzed. "Human," Okonkwo said, and she smiled warmly, "from the planet Earth." "Never heard of it," the clerk replied without looking up. "Take a number and wait in Processing Hall 7. Processing Hall 7 turned out to be a massive gray room filled with representatives from minor species, all waiting for their turn to be acknowledged by the Concord. And when Okonkwo checked the queue, she found that Earth had been placed behind a slug-like species that was applying for a waste disposal permit. Her crew shifted uncomfortably, but Okonkwo simply sat down and folded her hands in her lap and waited. They waited for 9 hours. When their turn finally came, they were led into a grand chamber where 3 enormous holographic figures looked down at them from elevated platforms. And these were the representatives of the 3 elder races who truly ran the Concord. The first was Sovereign Crystallarch Ithonsal of the Valith, an ancient being made of living crystal whose body refracted light in 1,000 colors, and whose species had been exploring the stars when Earth was still a ball of molten rock. The second was War Marshal Kreth Vaden of the Drakenhari, a towering reptilian creature covered in scales the color of dark iron, whose species had conquered and held more territory than any other civilization in galactic history. The third was Grand Ledger Ulvanthe of the Ulsha, a hive-minded collective that spoke through a single drone body and whose trade networks touched every corner of the galaxy. They looked down at the small group of humans, the way a mountain looks down at an ant. "You are the new species," Ithonsal said, his voice like wind chimes in a storm, "the ones from the outer arm." "We are," Okonkwo said, and she bowed respectfully, "and we come in peace to request membership in the Galactic Concord." What followed was the most humiliating 2 hours of her life. The Concord conducted what they called a civilization assessment, a standardized evaluation of any species requesting membership, and the results were broadcast live across the entire galactic communication network for anyone to watch. Humanity scored a 0.7 on the Kardashev Concord Index. It was the lowest score in recorded galactic history. The numbers were broken down on massive screens for all to see: primitive energy harvesting, laughable territorial range, no meaningful genetic modification, no neural networking capability, an average lifespan so short that several alien species in the gallery actually gasped, and perhaps most damning of all, a history of constant war against their own kind. "They fight themselves," a Drakenhari officer whispered from the gallery, and laughter rippled through the chamber. "Their ships are held together with welded metal," an Ulsha trade analyst noted, and more laughter followed. Their entire civilization exists on a single world, someone else said, and the laughter grew louder. Within hours, the broadcast had spread to every corner of the galaxy, and Earth became the biggest joke the conquered had ever seen, a punchline that wrote itself. And on space stations and colony worlds and trade hubs, everywhere a new phrase entered the common language, as useless as an earther. Clips circulated on galactic networks showing the fragility of the human body compared to other species. A human tripping and falling played beside footage of a Drakenhari walking through plasma fire without flinching. A human struggling to lift a heavy crate played beside footage of a Valith reshaping solid rock with a thought. A human catching a cold played beside footage of an Ulsha drone surviving the vacuum of space. The message was clear. These creatures were soft and weak and stupid, and had no business standing among the stars. In the grand chamber, Ithan Saw looked down at Captain Okonkwo with something between pity and amusement, and delivered the verdict that everyone already knew was coming. "Your application for membership is denied," he said, unanimously. The chamber fell quiet as the words settled like dust. "However," Ithan Saw continued, "the conquered is not without mercy, and we are prepared to offer your species a provisional observation status, which will allow a limited number of your kind to travel within conquered space for the purposes of learning and cultural exchange." Everyone in the room understood what this really was. It was a zoo pass, a leash, a pat on the head given to a species too primitive to be taken seriously, but too harmless to be worth turning away. Okonkwo's crew stood behind her with clenched fists and tight jaws, their faces burning with the humiliation of it, and Lieutenant Marrow looked like he was ready to say something he would regret. But Okonkwo simply smiled. It was a calm and quiet smile, the kind of smile that did not reach her eyes but sat on her lips like it knew something that no one else in the room could possibly understand. "We accept," she said, and she bowed again, "and we thank the conquered for its generosity." The elder races stared at her for a moment, uncertain of what to make of that smile, and then they moved on to the next item on their agenda, and the humans were escorted out of the chamber and back to their ugly little ship on the lower docking ring. As the olive branch undocked and began its long journey back toward the outer arm of the galaxy, Okonkwo stood alone in her quarters and opened an encrypted channel to Earth, a channel so deeply buried in subspace frequencies that no conquered sensor would ever detect it. She typed a single message and sent it across 26,000 light-years of empty space. They left the door open. And then she sat back in her chair and let the smile fall from her face, and what replaced it was something far more dangerous than anger, something far more powerful than pride. It was patience, the cold and calculated patience of a species that had spent its entire existence clawing its way up from the mud and the blood and the darkness, a species that had been told no 1,000 times before and had never once accepted it as a final answer. Back on the Oriat Spire, the gallery chattered and laughed and shared their favorite clips from the human assessment, and the elder races returned to their ancient business of managing a galaxy they believed they understood. None of them noticed that the small human ship had scanned every system it passed through on the way out. None of them noticed that every human crew member had been recording and cataloging everything they saw from the moment they stepped off the ship. And none of them stopped to wonder why a species that had just been publicly humiliated in front of 4,000 civilizations had walked out the door without a single word of protest. Because if they had stopped to wonder, if they had looked past the ugly ship and the short lifespans and the low score on their precious index, they might have seen the truth that Captain Adiz Okonkwo already knew in her bones. That humanity had never needed the galaxy's respect. It only needed the galaxy's door to be open. And now it was. The message arrived on Earth at 3 in the morning, and within 6 hours every government on the planet had seen it. And within 12 hours, something happened that had never happened before in the entire bloody and fractured history of the human race. Every single nation agreed. There were no arguments, no debates, no petitions or protests or elections about it, because every leader and every general and every scientist who read the briefing from the olive branch understood the same thing at the same time, that out there among the stars humanity was nothing, a joke, a footnote, and that if they wanted to survive in a galaxy that had already decided they were worthless, then they could not afford to be divided for even one more day. The project was given no public name, no speeches were made, no flags were waved, and the world simply and quietly began to work together under a single classified initiative that those involved called Project Longstep. And then the galaxy forgot about Earth. That was its first mistake. In the years that followed, humanity used its provisional observation status exactly the way the conquered intended. They sent small groups of humans out into conquered space to learn and observe and absorb the wonders of galactic civilization. But what the conquered did not understand was that every single human who left Earth was a carefully selected operative with a specific mission. They enrolled in alien universities and sat in the back of lecture halls and asked simple questions that made their professors laugh. And they took notes on everything. Not just what was taught, but how it was taught and what was left out, and what the professors assumed everyone already knew. They took menial jobs on space stations, cleaning crews and cargo handlers and food service workers. And while they mopped floors and carried crates, they watched and listened and memorized the layout of every system they touched, every piece of technology they came near, every conversation they overheard. They were janitors who understood quantum field theory, cooks who could recite Drakenhari weapon schematics from memory, bartenders who spoke 9 alien languages and could calculate interstellar trade routes in their heads. And nobody noticed because nobody looks twice at the help. A young physicist named Ryan Vasquez was among the first wave sent to study at the Great Valith Academy of Subspace Sciences, the most prestigious institution in the galaxy, where the crystalline scholars had been unraveling the secrets of reality itself for longer than human civilization had existed. Vasquez was quiet and polite and always sat in the front row, and one day during a lecture on subspace fold mechanics, he raised his hand and proposed a theorem that suggested it was possible to create a resonance cascade within a folded subspace field. A chain reaction that could theoretically disrupt any energy network no matter how large. The lecture hall erupted in laughter. The professor, a Valith crystal scholar whose body shimmered with the light of 10,000 years of accumulated knowledge, dismissed the theorem as the fantasy of a primitive mind, and told Vasquez that perhaps he should return to his homeworld and study something more suited to his species' capabilities, like agriculture. Vasquez nodded and thanked the professor and left the hall, and never mentioned the theorem again. 6 years later, the Valith Academic Council quietly reclassified the theorem as theoretically valid and restricted all access to it under their highest security protocols. But by then, it was too late because Vasquez had already sent his complete work back to Earth through channels that the Valith did not even know existed. This was how it went for 33 years. Humans learning everything, sharing nothing, asking for help with one hand while building something extraordinary with the other. On the frontier worlds and border stations where life was hard and resources were thin, human workers became quietly indispensable, not because they were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but because they were the most adaptable creatures anyone had ever seen. When a cooling system broke on a Drakenhari mining station, a human engineer fixed it using parts from a food processor and a cleaning drone, and the Drakenhari foreman stared at the repair for a full minute before muttering that it should not work, but it did. When a plague swept through an Ulsha trading colony, a human medical team arrived and worked for 72 hours straight without sleep, and synthesized a treatment by combining Ulsha biochemistry with a human antiviral approach that no Ulsha doctor had ever considered. And when the colony was saved, the Ulsha Grand Ledger made a note in his private files that said simply, "Watch the humans." When two rival species on a contested border world were on the verge of war, a human diplomat sat down with both sides and somehow got them talking. And within a week, there was a ceasefire. And within a month, there was a trade agreement, and the diplomat was asked how she had done it, and she shrugged and said, "Where I come from, we have a lot of practice at this." Every 5 years, Earth sent a new ambassador to the Oriot Spire to formally request membership in the Galactic Concord, and every 5 years the request was denied, and every 5 years the ambassador smiled politely and said, "Perhaps next time," and left without protest. The Ulsha trade lords were the first to find this pattern unsettling, because the Ulsha understood patience as a weapon better than anyone, and they recognized it when they saw it in another species' eyes. But even the Ulsha did not see the full picture, because the full picture was hidden behind the smiles, and the patience and the quiet competence, buried so deep that even the Concord's intelligence networks could not find it. Back on Earth and in secret facilities hidden across the solar system, the real work was happening. The synthesis of everything humanity had learned from every species they had studied, every technology they had touched, every principle they had absorbed, all of it being woven together into something new, something that no single alien species could have created because no single alien species thought the way humans thought. The Valith were brilliant but rigid, the Drakenhari were powerful but unimaginative, the Ulsha were cunning but risk-averse, and each species had built its civilization within the boundaries of its own nature, never looking beyond, never borrowing, never blending. Humans had no such boundaries. They took Valith crystal computing and merged it with human neural network design, and the result was a processing system that made both species' original technology look like counting on fingers. They took Drakenhari weapons theory and filtered it through human tactical doctrine, and the result was a weapons platform that was smaller and cheaper, and more versatile than anything the Drakenhari had ever built. They took Ulsha logistics and applied human game theory, and the result was a supply chain model that could sustain a military campaign across 1,000 light-years without a single point of failure. And in a lab buried beneath the ice of Europa, Dr. Ryan Vasquez, now older and grayer and no longer the young man who had been laughed out of a Valith lecture hall, worked on the weapon that would one day save the galaxy, built on the theorem that the galaxy had called a fantasy. None of this was visible to the Concord. All the Concord saw was a species of short-lived fragile creatures who were surprisingly good at cleaning floors and fixing pipes, and who kept politely asking for membership like children who did not understand the word no. But there were cracks in the galaxy's confidence, small moments that those who paid attention might have noticed. Deep space sensors began detecting anomalous readings at the galaxy's rim, in a remote stretch of space called the Vithon Corridor, and relay stations in that region started going dark one by one, and ships that traveled through the corridor began to vanish without a trace. The Concord classified these events as pirate activity and allocated minimal resources to investigate because the Vithon Corridor was far from the core, and the species who lived there were not important enough to worry about. Earth's intelligence analysts read those same reports and reached a very different conclusion, and they accelerated the timetable for Project Longstep by 3 years. On a space station orbiting a trade world in the mid-rim, an Ulsha merchant lord sat at a bar late at night, his body swaying with the effects of chemical vapors, and he looked at the human bartender who was quietly wiping down the counter, and something in the merchant's ancient trade-sharpened mind flickered with unease. "You little creatures," the Ulsha slurred, leaning forward with his many eyes unfocused. "You are always watching, always listening, always smiling. Always so very patient, and he tapped one of his long fingers on the bar and said, "What are you waiting for?" The bartender set down the glass she was cleaning and looked at the merchant lord with an expression that was polite and empty and completely unreadable. She said nothing, and the Ulsha merchant lord felt a chill run through his body that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room, because in that silence, in that calm and patient silence, he heard something that his species had spent 10,000 years learning to recognize. He heard the sound of a trap that had already been set. It began with silence. Not the comfortable silence of a quiet night or the respectful silence of a memorial, but the wrong kind of silence, the kind that arrives when something that should be making noise simply stops, the kind that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up even when you cannot explain why. 46 star systems in the Vithon corridor went dark in 72 hours. No distress calls, no evacuation signals, no emergency broadcasts, no final transmissions full of static and screaming. Just nothing, as if someone had reached into that stretch of the galaxy and turned off the lights the way you would turn off a lamp before going to bed. Billions of beings lived in those systems, farmers and miners and traders and children and elders. And in the span of 3 days they were simply gone, replaced by a silence so complete that even the background radiation of space seemed to dim in that region, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The Galactic Concord responded the way it always responded to threats, with overwhelming force. War Marshal Kreth Vaden of the Drakenhari personally authorized the deployment of the Second Grand Fleet, 12,000 warships crewed by the finest soldiers in the galaxy, each vessel armed with weapons that could crack a planet in half, and the fleet was accompanied by 400 Valith sensor platforms, and a full Ulsha logistics convoy to sustain a prolonged campaign. It was the largest military operation the Concord had launched in 6,000 years, and as the fleet entered the Vithon corridor, the galaxy watched the live feeds with the confident expectation that whatever had caused the disturbance would be crushed within days. Contact was lost in 9 hours. 12,000 ships, millions of crew members, and the most advanced military technology in the known galaxy, all gone in less time than it takes a human to sleep through the night. The feeds showed nothing because there was nothing to show. One moment the fleet was transmitting, and the next moment it was not, as if it had never existed, as if the Vithon corridor had simply swallowed it whole and closed its mouth. Now the galaxy began to pay attention. The Concord's intelligence services pulled every record they could find and deep in the oldest archives of the Valith, buried under layers of classification so ancient that the access codes had been forgotten. They found a single entry, a warning left by a civilization that had died 2 million years before any current species had learned to speak. The entry described an entity called the HFY. It was not a species, not a nation, not an empire. It was a machine, or rather it was a network of machines, a self-replicating post-singularity intelligence that had been built by a long-dead civilization as a tool for harvesting energy, and that had long ago outgrown its creators and consumed them, and then continued to grow, feeding on matter and energy and information, converting everything it touched into more of itself the way a fire converts wood into flame. The ancient record said that the HFY had swept through the galaxy 2 million years ago and had been stopped only when it ran out of fuel and entered a dormant state somewhere in the void between galaxies, and the civilization that left the warning had believed that dormancy was permanent. They were wrong. The HFY had woken up, and it was hungry, and it was moving inward toward the galactic core at a speed that doubled with every system it consumed, because every system it consumed gave it more material to build more of itself. It did not communicate because it had nothing to say. It did not negotiate because it had no desires that could be bargained with. It did not hate and it did not love and it did not think in any way that a living mind could understand. It simply expanded, endlessly and mindlessly, the way a crystal grows in a solution, the way a virus replicates in a host, the way a shadow spreads when the light goes out. And it could not be stopped by force because force was food. Every weapon fired at it, every ship that crashed into it, every bomb that detonated against its surface was just more energy and more matter for it to absorb and convert and grow. The conquered understood this too late. War Marshal Vaden sent 6 more fleets into the corridor over the next 4 months and lost every single one. And each defeat made the Asheville stronger because each fleet was a feast of metal and energy that it devoured and incorporated into its expanding body. The emergency sessions at the Oriat Spire descended into chaos. The Valith retreated into their crystal archives and began the process of recording and preserving all knowledge in case their civilization was destroyed, which was their way of saying they had given up. The Drakenhari raged and roared and demanded more fleets and bigger weapons, and refused to accept that their military might was useless against an enemy that ate military might for breakfast. The Ulshah said nothing in the public sessions, but behind closed doors, they were quietly moving their most valuable assets into pocket dimensions and hidden vaults, preparing to survive even if the rest of the galaxy did not. The smaller species, the thousands of civilizations that filled the ranks of the conquered, panicked, and refugee fleets clogged the transit lanes as entire worlds tried to flee from the advancing wall of silence, and fights broke out at space stations over fuel and food and docking space, and governments collapsed and alliances shattered, and everywhere there was fear, a deep and primal fear that spread faster than the Asheville itself. System after system went dark. The Vithon corridor was just the beginning, and the silence spread outward like a stain on a map, swallowing colonies and trade hubs and military outposts and ancient homeworlds with the same indifferent efficiency. And the projections showed that, at its current rate of acceleration, the Asheville would reach the galactic core, and the Oriat Spire itself within 18 months. The greatest civilizations the galaxy had ever known, species that had mastered the fundamental forces of the universe, species that had built megastructures and conquered death and reshaped the fabric of space and time, stood paralyzed before something they could not fight and could not reason with and could not outrun. And in the midst of this terror, in the eye of this storm of panic and despair, something strange was happening that it took the galaxy far too long to notice. Earth was quiet. Not the silence of fear or the silence of collapse. A different kind of silence, the kind that comes from a household where everyone has stopped talking because they are all very busy doing something very specific and very important. No panic transmissions came from Earth, no refugee applications, no requests for emergency aid, no desperate pleas to the conquered for protection, just calm, steady silence from the little blue world in the outer arm that everyone had forgotten about. Ambassador Lena Zheng sat in the observation gallery of the Oriat Spire and watched the war feeds on the massive screens that showed system after system winking out of existence. And she took notes on a small datapad with the unhurried focus of a student in a lecture hall. And around her the alien diplomats screamed and wept and argued, and she sat among them like a stone in a river, unmoved and unafraid. It was Sovereign Crystallarch Ithansal who finally approached her. He had not spoken to a human directly in 34 years, not since the day he had denied Earth's first application for membership. And as he moved through the panicked crowd toward the small human woman sitting calmly in her chair, his crystal body flickered with colors that his species associated with deep unease. "You're kind," he said, and his voice was quieter than she had expected, almost fragile. "You knew this was coming." Zheng looked up from her datapad and met his gaze, and in her eyes there was no anger and no satisfaction and no fear, only the calm, steady focus of someone who had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. "No," she said, "we did not know this specifically was coming. But we knew something was coming because something is always coming. That is the one lesson our history has taught us better than any other, that the universe does not care how advanced you are, or how powerful you are, or how long you have existed, and that the only species that survive are the ones who prepare for the worst while everyone else is celebrating the best. She paused and looked at the screens where another system had just gone dark, and then looked back at the ancient crystal being who towered above her. "Would you like to hear our proposal?" she asked. And Ithon Sol, sovereign crystallarch of the Valith, elder of elders, a being who had watched stars be born and die, looked down at this small, soft, short-lived creature from a world he had once dismissed as irrelevant, and he felt something he had not felt in 10,000 years. He felt hope. "Yes," he said, and his voice cracked like glass under pressure. "Yes, I would very much like to hear it." Ambassador Lena Zheng stood before the emergency session of the Galactic Concord, and she did not ask for permission to speak, because she was not asking for anything at all. She was giving a briefing. The chamber was packed with representatives from thousands of species, their faces and bodies and sensor organs all turned toward this small human woman who stood at the center podium, where no human had ever been allowed to stand. And the room was so quiet that the hum of the spire's power systems was the loudest sound in it. 34 years ago, Zheng began, you told us we were too primitive to sit among you, and you were right, we were, by every measure you use, but you made an error in your assessment, and the error was this. You measured what we were and assumed that was what we would always be. She tapped her datapad, and a holographic display filled the chamber with schematics and data streams, and tactical projections that made several alien scientists in the gallery lean forward in their seats. You called our initiative Project Longstep, though you never knew its name, and it was not one project. It was 312 projects running simultaneously across every continent on Earth and in facilities hidden throughout our solar system, and every single one of them was built on knowledge we gathered from you. The room stirred with unease. We learned your crystal computing, she said, nodding toward the Valith delegation, and we merged it with our neural network architecture and created processing systems that are 17 times faster than anything either of our species had alone. The Valith delegation went very still. We studied your weapons theory, she said, turning to the Drakenhari, and we ran it through our tactical doctrine, and we built weapons platforms that are smaller and more adaptable than anything in your current arsenal. War Marshal Vaden's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. We analyzed your logistics networks, she said to the Ulsha, and we applied our own mathematical models, and we designed a supply chain that can sustain a full military campaign across 1,000 light-years without a single critical failure point. The Ulsha Grand Ledger's many eyes blinked rapidly, which in their species was an expression of extreme alarm. You gave us observation status, Zheng continued, and we observed, not because we were grateful for scraps, but because we understood that the galaxy is the greatest library ever built, and all we needed was a library card. She paused and let the silence fill the room, and then she said the words that changed everything. We have a fleet, and we have a weapon, and we have a plan to stop the Asheville, and we are offering all of it to the conquered freely, without conditions, because this is not about politics or pride or revenge. This is about survival, and survival is something my species understands better than anyone in this room. Before anyone could respond, before the shouting and the questions and the disbelief could begin, she transmitted a set of coordinates to every screen in the chamber, coordinates pointing to the Sol system, to Earth's own solar neighborhood. See for yourselves, she said. And the Conquered pointed its long-range sensors toward the outer arm of the galaxy, and what they saw took their breath away. From behind Jupiter, emerging from the shadow of the gas giant like wolves stepping out of a forest, came warships, not many by galactic standards, only about 2,000, but they were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. They were ugly in the way that human things were often ugly, built for function rather than beauty, covered in rough angles and exposed conduits and armor plating that looked like it had been welded on by hand. But beneath that rough exterior, they carried technology that made the Concord's analysts stammer in confusion. Valith crystal cores hummed at the heart of each ship, driving processing systems that could calculate 1,000,000 tactical variables in real time, and Drakenhari-inspired weapons arrays lined their hulls, redesigned by human engineers to fire in patterns that no Drakenhari strategist had ever conceived. And Ulsha logistics algorithms ran through their supply networks, optimized by human mathematicians to eliminate every possible inefficiency. And then there were the things that were purely human, the jury-rigged modifications, the improvised systems, the creative shortcuts that violated at least a dozen laws of physics according to every established galactic theory, but worked anyway because the humans who built them did not care what the theories said. They only cared about what was possible when you stopped telling yourself what was impossible. More ships launched from beneath the ice of Europa, and from hollowed-out asteroids in the belt, and from hidden docks on the dark side of the moon, and the United Earth Expeditionary Force assembled in formation and began its long burn toward the front lines. At the head of the fleet was the flagship, a heavy cruiser named the UES Remember, and on its bridge stood Admiral Kofi Asant, a man who had spent 20 years helping design these ships and who had turned down a comfortable retirement to be the one who flew them into the fire. "All ships report ready," his communications officer said. "Then let us go to work," Asant replied. The plan was the brainchild of Dr. Ryan Vasquez, now 61 years old with gray hair and tired eyes and hands that shook slightly from too many years of caffeine and too little sleep. And it was based on the theorem that the Valith had laughed at, and then quietly classified as correct when they thought no one was watching. The Asheville was a network, a vast interconnected web of nodes that shared energy and information and coordination across distances that span light years. And its strength came from that connection, from the fact that every part of it could draw on every other part, making the whole far greater than the sum of its pieces. Vasquez's weapon did not try to destroy the nodes because destruction was just feeding the beast. Instead, it targeted the connections themselves, using a subspace resonance disruptor that created a cascading interference pattern in the folded space between nodes, severing their links and isolating each piece from the whole. You do not kill a wildfire by throwing water at it. You build fire breaks. You cut the connections. You turn one massive, unstoppable force into 1,000 small, manageable pieces. The first engagement happened in the Koreth system, a binary star system that the Asheville had consumed 3 weeks earlier, and when the human fleet dropped out of FTL and opened fire, the galaxy watched on every screen and every feed and every display. The disruptor beams hit the Asheville's network like a hammer hitting glass, and for the first time since it had awakened, the ancient machine intelligence, stuttered nodes that had been seamlessly coordinated, suddenly found themselves cut off from their neighbors, unable to share energy or information, and they slowed and dimmed and drifted like embers separated from a fire. But the Asheville adapted, because that was what it did, and it began rerouting its connections through deeper layers of subspace, and the human fleet found itself in a battle that was less like a war and more like a chess match played at the speed of light. This was where humanity's true nature revealed itself. Human crews did things that no other species would have considered sane. Pilots flew their ships into the narrow gaps between Asheville nodes to plant disruptors at point-blank range. Engineers rerouted power systems mid-battle by physically rewiring consoles with their bare hands while the ship shook around them. Tactical officers abandoned their carefully prepared plans and improvised new ones in real time based on nothing but instinct and desperation. A destroyer called the UES Defiance lost its engines to an Asheville energy pulse, and its captain, a woman named Yuki Tanaka, ordered her crew to abandon ship, and then manually steered the crippled vessel into a central Asheville node using nothing but attitude thrusters and willpower. and she rode that dying ship all the way in and detonated its disruptor payload at the core, and the explosion severed the connections of an entire sector of the network. She did not survive, but her crew did, and they floated in their escape pods and watched the HFY nodes around them go dark one by one like candles blown out by a wind. The alien observers who watched the battle feeds could not understand what they were seeing. This was not how war was fought. This was not rational or calculated or efficient. This was something raw and primal and terrifying, a species that fought not with the cold precision of superior technology, but with the wild, desperate fury of creatures who had spent their entire evolutionary history fighting for survival against a universe that had been trying to kill them since the day they crawled out of the ocean. System by system, the HFY's advance stalled and its network fragmented and the fire breaks held. And behind the human lines, the isolated nodes drifted inert and harmless like dead leaves on still water. But the cost was staggering. The UES, remember, took a direct hit that killed 80 crew members, and Admiral Assant commanded the rest of the battle with blood running down his face from a gash on his forehead. 40% of the human fleet was destroyed or disabled in the first 3 months of fighting. Tens of thousands of human soldiers died in battles fought in systems they had never heard of, defending species that had spent 30 years calling them useless. And they did not stop. They did not retreat, and they did not surrender, and they did not negotiate. And when they were afraid, they fought anyway. And when their ships were broken, they fixed them with whatever they had. And when their friends died beside them, they screamed and wept, and then they got up and kept fighting. Sovereign Crystallarch Ithansal watched a battle feed in his private chambers as a human destroyer with failing engines and a breached hull turned itself toward an HFY core node and accelerated. And through the ship's open communications channel, he could hear the crew singing, not a war song, not an anthem, just a simple melody that humans sang to comfort each other in the dark. And they sang it all the way to the end. Ithansal turned to his council, and his crystal body was dim, almost gray, drained of the light that his species used to express emotion, because what he felt in that moment was too large for light to carry. "We mocked them," he said, and his voice sounded like cracking glass. "Ancestors, forgive us, we mocked them." The HFY came for the heart of the galaxy on a Tuesday. It should not have mattered what day it was. Days were a human concept that meant nothing in the vast mathematics of interstellar war. But the humans kept track because humans always kept track of time, not because they had so much of it, but because they had so little. The final concentration of the HFY, the densest and most powerful cluster of nodes remaining in its shattered network, pushed through the inner systems toward the aureate spire itself, drawn to the massive energy signature of the conquered seat of power like a moth to a flame. And as it moved, it consumed everything in its path, growing stronger with every system it swallowed, regenerating the connections that the human fleet had spent months severing. Commander Ife Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the UES Olive Branch II, named for her grandmother's ship, the ugly little vessel that had carried humanity's first delegation to the Spire 35 years ago. And she looked at the tactical display and counted the red markers that represented HFY nodes, and then she counted the blue markers that represented what was left of the human fleet. The numbers were not kind. 60% of the United Earth Expeditionary Force was gone, destroyed or damaged beyond repair in the brutal campaign that had ground across the galaxy for nearly a year. And the ships that remained were battered and patched, and held together in some cases by nothing more than emergency welding and stubbornness. But they were here, all of them, every last ship that could still fly, assembled in a defensive formation between the advancing HFY and the aureate spire. And behind them, the spire itself glittered in the light of its dying star, home to the government that had once laughed at humanity and was now depending on humanity to save it. "Commander," her tactical officer said quietly, "the Drakenhari 3rd Reserve Fleet is requesting permission to join our formation." Okonkwo looked up from her display, and for a moment she did not understand what she had heard, because, in the entire history of the Drakenhari military, no Drakenhari fleet had ever placed itself under the command of another species. "Repeat that," she said. "The Drakenhari 3rd Reserve Fleet, 412 ships, is requesting permission to join our formation under your command. War Marshal Vaden sends his personal regards and says, and I am quoting directly here, that if the humans can fight then the Drakenhari can certainly follow." Before Okonkwo could respond, another transmission came in. The Valeth Science Directorate was deploying its crystal resonance platforms to amplify the range of the human disruptor weapons. And behind them, an Ulsha logistics convoy was arriving with enough fuel and ammunition to sustain the fleet for 72 hours of continuous combat. And then more signals came, one after another, ships from species whose names Okonkwo had never learned, small fleets and single vessels and converted cargo haulers and ancient warships pulled out of museums, all of them converging on the spire, all of them asking the same thing. "Where do you need us?" For 35 years the galaxy had watched humanity from a distance, first with contempt and then with indifference and then with growing unease and then with shock and then with awe. And now at the end of everything, with the darkness closing in and the silence spreading and the great civilizations of the conquered frozen in fear, the galaxy looked at the small battered human fleet that stood between them and extinction and made a choice. They chose to stand with the creatures they had once called useless. Okonkwo felt something tighten in her chest, and she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel it, and then she straightened her back and opened a channel to all ships. "All vessels, this is Commander Okonkwo of the United Earth Expeditionary Force. Form on our line, match our heading and follow our lead. Today we hold this position or we die here, and there is no third option." The battle for the Oriat Spire was the largest military engagement in 2 million years, and it lasted for 11 hours that felt like 11 lifetimes. The Asheville came in a wave that blotted out the stars, a wall of dark metallic mass that pulsed with stolen energy, and the combined fleet met it with everything it had: disruptor beams and plasma fire and missile salvos and crystal resonance pulses. And the space around the spire turned into a hell of light and metal and destruction. Human ships led the charge because they always led the charge, diving into the gaps in the Asheville's network to plant disruptors at close range. And behind them, the Drakenhari warships laid down covering fire with a ferocity that shook the hulls of every vessel in the fleet. And the Valeth platforms sang with energy as they amplified the disruptor signals across wider and wider areas. Ships died, human ships and alien ships alike, and the darkness kept coming, kept pushing, kept trying to reach the spire and the feast of energy it represented. And for every node that the fleet severed, 2 more seemed to take its place. In the 4th hour of the battle, the UES Remember, Admiral Asant's flagship, took a catastrophic hit that tore the ship nearly in half, and Asant ordered his crew to evacuate while he remained on the bridge to keep the ship's disruptor array firing for as long as possible. And his last transmission was a set of tactical coordinates that he had calculated by hand because his computers were dead. Coordinates that allowed 3 other ships to target a critical junction in the Asheville's network and sever it. In the 7th hour, a Drakenhari cruiser and a human frigate, both crippled and drifting, lashed themselves together with tow cables and combined their remaining weapons systems into a single battery that they fired in tandem until both ships finally went dark, and the crews floated in their escape pods side by side, Drakenhari and human, and they did not speak because they did not share a language, but they did not need one. In the 9th hour, Dr. Ryan Vasquez, who was aboard a science vessel behind the front lines, identified a pattern in the Asheville's regeneration cycle, a brief window of vulnerability that occurred every 47 minutes when the network attempted to rebuild its severed connections. And he transmitted the finding to the fleet, and the human tacticians adapted their strategy in real time, timing their disruptor strikes to hit during those windows, and the effect was devastating. The Asheville began to collapse. Not all at once, not in a dramatic explosion or a sudden cessation, but slowly and steadily, like a fire burning itself out, its nodes going dark one by one as the connections that sustained them were severed faster than they could regenerate. And the wall of darkness that had threatened to swallow the galaxy began to thin and break apart and dissolve into drifting fragments of inert metal. In the 11th hour, Commander Ife Okonkwo targeted the last remaining core node, the central processing hub of the entire Asheville network, the original seed from which the ancient machine intelligence had grown 2 million years ago. And she fired every disruptor on her ship at once, and the beam hit the node, and the node went dark. And then there was silence. Not the terrible silence of consumption, not the silence of systems going dark and civilizations being erased, but a different silence, a gentle silence, the silence that follows a storm when the rain has stopped and the wind has died and the world is still, and you realize that you are alive. "Is it done?" someone whispered on the bridge of the Olive Branch II. Okonkwo stared at the tactical display, where the red markers were fading one by one like embers cooling in the dark, and she let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 35 years. "It is done," she said. The galaxy counted its dead, and the numbers were too large to comprehend. Billions of alien lives lost in the systems the Asheville had consumed before humanity intervened, and 83,000 human military personnel killed in the campaign to stop it, and 17 human ships lost with all hands, their crews gone forever into the dark between the stars. Earth mourned quietly and deeply, the way it did everything. 3 weeks after the battle, the Galactic Concord convened a special session, and for the first time in the history of the institution, a human delegation was not placed in a queue or made to wait in a processing hall. They were escorted to the center of the grand chamber, to the place of highest honor, and every representative of every species in the Concord rose to their feet as they entered. Sovereign Crystallarch Ithan Sol, his crystal body restored to full brilliance and shining with colors that his species reserved for moments of deepest reverence, addressed the chamber. "The Concord offers the people of Earth full membership with all rights and privileges, effective immediately, and further offers a permanent seat on the Elder Council, a distinction held by only 3 species in 80,000 years of galactic governance." The chamber erupted in applause and song, and the stamping of appendages, and the flashing of bioluminescent organs, and every other way that 4,000 different species expressed overwhelming approval. Ambassador Lena Zheng stepped forward and raised her hand, and the chamber fell silent. "We accept membership," she said, "with gratitude." She paused. "But we decline the Elder Council seat." The silence that followed was so complete that Ithan Sol's light flickered with confusion. "We did not do this for a seat at your table," Zheng said, and her voice was steady and calm and carried the weight of everything her species had endured and sacrificed and built in the last 35 years. "We did it because it needed to be done, because that is what we are. We are the species that runs toward the fire, not because we are brave but because we cannot help it, because something in our blood and our bones will not allow us to stand by while others suffer." She turned and looked at the delegations from the Vithon corridor, the refugee species who had lost their homeworlds, who had been the first victims of the Asheville and the last to be remembered by the Concord. "Give the seat to them," she said. "They have lost more than anyone, and they need a voice more than we need a title." The chamber was silent for a long time, and then Ithan Sol bowed, which was something his species had not done to another being in recorded history, and he said simply, "As you wish." In the months and years that followed, the galaxy changed in ways that no one had predicted. Alien scholars began studying humanity not as a curiosity or a punchline, but as a genuine mystery. How had a species so fragile and short-lived, and internally divided become the ones who held the line when every other civilization broke. The answer, when it finally came, was so simple that it embarrassed the scholars who had spent decades looking for something more complex. Humans were weak, and because they were weak they learned to build, to adapt, to cooperate, to fight beyond all reason. Every limitation was a lesson, every vulnerability was a teacher, and the sum of all those lessons was a species that could not be predicted or contained or defeated, because it never stopped learning and never stopped growing and never ever gave up. At the center of the Aureate spire, a memorial was erected, and it was not grand or ornate or built from exotic materials. It was a simple pillar of gray granite carved from the mountains of Earth and shipped across 26,000 light-years of space, and on it, in every language of every conquered species, was inscribed a single human proverb: "Do not mistake my kindness for weakness." And the galaxy was quiet again. But it was a different quiet now, not the silence of contempt and not the silence of catastrophe, but the warm and steady silence of respect. The kind of quiet that falls over a room when someone walks in who does not need to announce themselves because everyone already knows who they are. When human ships passed through conquered space, alien vessels dipped their running lights in salute, and when human diplomats entered a chamber, conversations paused, not out of fear but out of recognition. And when the people of Earth looked up at the stars, they no longer saw a galaxy that had mocked them. They saw a galaxy that was finally, after all this time, home. Years later, on a frontier world at the edge of explored space, a young alien child looked up at the night sky and saw a human trade ship passing overhead, its running lights blinking against the darkness, and she tugged on her mother's arm and asked why everyone always spoke of the humans with such respect. Her mother knelt down beside her and looked up at the ship and smiled. "Because when the stars went dark," she said softly, "and the great empires ran, the little species from the little blue world did not run, they lit a fire, child, and they held it up for all of us." The child watched the ship until it disappeared into the stars, and she held her mother's hand, and in the silence of that frontier night, she understood something that the whole galaxy had learned the hard way: that the smallest light burns the brightest in the dark,